That's good. You guys okay? We're gonna start.
Yep.
Okay. Zach, you ready? Good afternoon. I'm honored to join you just a day before the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. I'm Josh Gottheimer. I'm here with my colleagues and also families of 9/11 victims. It's a day that still burns brightly in my mind and scars the soul of our nation even all these years later. Today, we'll hear from other colleagues to talk about the concrete action we're taking on the Bipartisan American Victims of Terror Compensation Act, which ensures justice for the victims of 9/11 and other state-sponsored terror attacks along with their families. On September 11th, 2001, America experienced the worst terror attack on our soil ever and our freedoms in history. We lost nearly 3,000 Americans, including 750 from my state of New Jersey. In an instant, moms and dads were taken away from their families. Hundreds of New Jersey and New York law enforcement, firefighters, and EMTs bravely answered the call on that day, running into burning buildings and dove into the rubble, even at the cost to their health and, in some cases, their lives. Since this horrific attack on our soil, we've lost more than 360 FDNY firefighters and EMTs, 11 Port Authority law enforcement, including many from New Jersey, because of 9/11 related illnesses. This attack continues to this day, with first responder death tolls after 9/11 exceeding the death toll on that awful day. And we lost 28 FDNY firefighters this year alone. 28. It's staggering. During this time, I think of the wreckage that 9/11 has left behind. All of those children who grew up without parents, robbed of their childhood memories, the medical bills that have piled up for victims and their families as they work to recover and move forward. More than 20 years on, we have a solemn duty. First, to stand up to terrorism at home and abroad. Second, to support the victims of state-sponsored terror attacks like 9/11 and their families. Since I've come to Congress, we've fought year in and year out to make sure that 9/11 families and first responders get the support they deserve. It's a shame that we actually have to be here today with this group to fight to help these victims. This isn't a partisan issue, as you can see. It's a bipartisan issue. It's an American issue. It's a human issue. In 2019, we worked for the Never Forget the Heroes Act to give 9/11 victims, some families, some relief after the years of waiting. It was the least we could do to honor the legacy of first responders like James Zadroga, who the bill was named after, a New Jersey native who died in 2006 from 9/11 respiratory illnesses. This year, we lost his father, Joseph, who was one of the fiercest advocates I've ever met. The American Victims of Terror Compensation Act takes it a step further. You'll hear more about it in a minute from my colleagues, and ensures it giving a helping hand to those directly impacted by state-sponsored terrorism by fixing the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Fund. Our bill guarantees the fund can compensate victims and their families like those behind us this year and moving forward, and it gives the staffs the fund and makes it accountable to Congress. It's critical that we reform the fund. So let's say a prayer for the innocent souls lost on 9/11, their families and our country, and those who've lost their lives since. Together we'll denounce the evils of terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, lone wolf terror, and more, and we recommit ourselves to getting this bill passed, delivering justice and standing by the victims and their families. In the greatest country in the world, I know if we work together, our best days will always be ahead. I'm honored to be joined by my colleagues who you'll hear from in a minute. Let me start, though, with Lisa Lockett to talk about from the 9/11 families, to represent them, and then you'll hear from Mr. Lawler, Ms. Meliatakis, Ms. Molinaro, Mr. And who else is here? Who am I forgetting? Oh, Jared, Mr. Moskowitz will follow. Thank you so much. Lisa?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lisa Luckett. My husband, Teddy, died at the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th. I'm here with you today because this is such an important piece of legislation for us as the families. The US VSST, which set up this original fund, and the Fairness for 9/11 Families Act, which brought it all together for us a couple of years ago, are both very common sense based, logical, undisputed bills that pass with large majorities in both the Senate and the Congress without question. Today, going to the floor, the American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act, or better known as the Fund to Fund Act for those of us that don't speak this, will provide the immediate distribution of funds to the US VSST for a future funding stream of excess DOJ dollars to help support and make whole the 9/11 families, the children, the widows, the siblings, and the parents. At this time, the fund has not been doing what it was designed to do, and very few distributions have been made. we ask that you please bring the fund to the floor and vote for it today. 9/11 is now deeply woven into the fabric of our American society. Books and movies, school curriculum, social conversation, 9/11 comes up on a regular basis. For my kids and for all the kids who lost parents that day, this is a metaphorical gut punch that they take before they even know it's coming. There's also not a time when I meet someone that they don't find out my story and immediately tell me in vivid detail where they were and what happened to them that morning. This is so deeply personal for us. It makes it different than anything else that has come before or since, because it happens so tangibly. My kids and I have ridden this emotional roller coaster for the past 23 years, and it has been a doozy. I wish I could explain it, but there really are no words. I see my husband reflected in all three of my kids in the most wonderful ways, and at the same time it's so bittersweet because they'll never know him. They've heard how wonderful he was, how funny he was, how loving he was, what an amazing friend he was, what an amazing dancer he was. So for my daughter, who recently got engaged and is planning her wedding for next year, it's a very harsh reality when she thinks about the coveted father-daughter dance that she won't have. So living with this loss, while it's been so long, is still very present for those of us who were affected that day, as everyone was. And I don't want to diminish anyone else's experience of it. It was bad for everyone. So with that in mind, and that said, please bring this vote to the floor today and pass it on the behalf of all the 9/11 families. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. This is obviously a very poignant moment on the cusp of the 23rd anniversary of the terrorist attacks of September 11th. On September 11th, 2001, I was in my 5th day of freshman year of high school at Suffern High School in Rockland County, New York. And I remember vividly sitting in my Spanish language class when the announcement came over the loudspeaker about the first plane hitting the North Tower and the pandemonium that ensued. Nobody had the level of access to cell phones and the ability to text message and get an immediate contact as we do today. And so many of my fellow classmates and I were concerned about where our parents were and what was happening in that moment. And you think 23 years later, and we are still dealing with the effects of that fateful day. We are still losing first responders, construction workers, sanitation workers who were down on the pile at ground zero to 9/11 related illnesses. It's not just the 2,977 lives we lost that day. We are still dealing with the consequences of it. And so, as an elected official from New York, the issue of 9/11 is very personal. And it's one that is bipartisan and requires strong support from Congress. And so, over the many years since, we've had many members of Congress champion different legislation and take up this mantle. But I am proud to work on this legislation, to lead this legislation, the American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act, to make sure that we fulfill our commitment to the families, to the victims of 9/11 and other terrorist attacks. And so it is critically important, as we approach the 23rd anniversary tomorrow, that we get this legislation passed. This should have broad bipartisan support. These families deserve an answer. And so I'm calling on leadership in both the House and the Senate to bring this bill to the floor for a vote. As it has in the past, it will pass overwhelmingly because most members of Congress recognize the responsibility we owe to the victims of terrorism and to the families of those who died on September 11th, 2001. And so this is our commitment, and we will fight to get this done immediately. And with that, I want to bring up Angela Mistrulli, a 9/11 family member, to come up and say a few words.
Hello, my name is Angela Mistrulli. I lost my father, Joseph Mistrulli, on September 11th, 2001. I want to first thank all of the representatives here today for their staunch support of all victims of terrorism, both previously and current, and their commitment moving forward. As we approach another anniversary of September 11th, I am reminded of the profound loss and enduring pain that so many families, including my own, continue to experience. While it is heartening to see our elected officials attend our memorials and post tributes on social media, these gestures, though they are greatly and deeply appreciated, are not enough. The true measure of commitment today to honor the victims and support their families lies in the actions beyond symbolic moments. We need our leaders to champion and pass the American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act as soon as possible. This legislation represents a tangible step towards justice and support for those who have suffered due to acts of terrorism. It is an opportunity for members of Congress to provide meaningful assistance to victims and their families, ensuring that they receive the recognition that they deserve. I urge our elected officials to move beyond these ceremonial gestures and take concrete actions by passing H.R. 8419, the American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act. Let us honor the memory of my father and of all of those we have lost and who have been injured, and the ones that are here today irreparably harmed by acts of terrorism, by passing this bill into law. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis. I represent New York's 11th District, Staten Island and Brooklyn. My district had hundreds of people killed on September 11th. Innocent people who just went to work that day, just wanted to provide for their family, going about their daily business, and were killed by these monstrous terrorists. Still to this day, we see first responders, firefighters, police officers, recovery workers who are dying from 9/11 related illnesses. In fact, oftentimes I go to street naming ceremonies, and sadly they are for somebody who has died, succumbed to a 9/11 related illnesses. So 23 years later, this is real, this is raw, and this is painful to the people standing with me today and also the constituents that I represent. It is beyond fathomable that this government would not do the right thing for these Americans who lost loved ones to acts of terrorism. We can never fill the hole that was left. We can never make up for the memories that were lost. We can never bring back their loved ones. But the least we can do is to ensure that state sponsors of terrorism compensate these families for their losses. And today we're here to once again call for the fund to be funded and to make sure that they receive some piece of justice. There's other forms of justice that we continue to fight for as well, including bringing those monstrous terrorists and the mastermind to trial. We want a conviction. But we also need to make sure that these families are provided with the support that they need and deserve, and that the American government should ensure is provided. Thank you.
My name is Mindy Kleinberg. My husband Alan was killed in the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, 23 years ago tomorrow. That morning, Alan went to work early. I got our 3 kids ready for school and walked to the bus stop. We didn't know at the time, but those were the last few minutes of peace we would have for a very long time. When I learned that a plane had hit the first tower, I tried calling Alan repeatedly. At that exact moment, countless others were trying desperately to reach their loved ones as well, hoping for an assurance that they were okay. For me, that moment never came. In the years that followed, our family grappled with grief and anger. Grief because our family would never be the same, and anger because it felt like justice was out of reach. Over the years, there have been several efforts to provide support to victims of terrorism and their families. I am here today asking Congress to make one of those efforts a reality. The AVTCA is more than just legislation. It is a beacon of hope and justice for countless families who have suffered unimaginable losses due to acts of terrorism. It is crucial because it acknowledges the pain and sacrifices of victims and their families. It ensures that we are not forgotten and that our suffering is recognized and addressed by our government. Moreover, it sends a message, a powerful message to the world, that the United States stands firmly against terrorism and will support its citizens who have been affected by such heinous acts. It is a testament to our country's commitment to justice. We thank Representative Lawler, Gottheimer, Goldman, Nadler, Malliotakis, and Moskowitz for honoring the memories of those we have lost by ensuring that our families receive the support and modicum of justice we deserve. Thank you.
My name is Mark Molinaro. I represent the 19th District in the state of New York. 23 years ago tonight, Americans went to sleep not knowing the horror that would befall this nation the next morning. And like so many across the country, 23 years ago, we saw the horror and the attacks and the lives lost. 9/11 brought devastation not only to this country, but tore apart families, creating horrific victims. But in the immediacy of that attack, heroes were born. Men and women who were called to respond first. In the rescue and recovery and then ultimately rebuilding, more and more Americans came forward. Heroes, all of them still living with pain and loss and health-related issues, all deserving of America's attention and its support. Let's be very, very clear. This piece of legislation, bipartisan as it is, yes, should come to the floor, is unfortunately necessary, yet profoundly simple. America made a promise to the families represented here today. America made a promise to the victims and their families. America made a promise to the responders and those heroes who helped to recover, to rescue, and to restore. And yet here we are, because of the inability of this federal government to live up to that commitment, we need yet one more piece of legislation. And so I'll be very, very simple and short. This piece of legislation is meant to fulfill America's promise to the families that live on with significant loss. It is one that this country should uphold, not only in the aftermath of 9/11, but God forbid, state-sponsored terrorist attacks against our country ever. This is a simple, fundamental expectation. No excuses, no delays, no red tape. Support these families. Live up to the legacy that their loved ones left behind, and ensure America fulfills this very basic promise.
Jared Moskowitz from Florida's 23rd District. I want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Lawler and Congressman Gottheimer, for leading this effort, and my other colleagues that are on the bill. Everybody remembers where they were for 9/11. I was a GW student watching smoke billow from the Pentagon from my window. And yet, these families behind us are here to lobby us for the obvious. And this has gone on for 2 decades now, since 9/11. Families having to come to Capitol Hill time and time again to remind us of the promise that we made to them. And yet Congress and the federal government has continued to fail them at every turn. And so I'm here to stand in solidarity with them. This is what the American people expect us to do when they send us here. This is what they expect us to do. When there is disasters in this country, they expect us on a bipartisan basis to come together. They don't expect red tape. That's what they want to see. And so I want to thank the families who have crisscrossed the country fighting for this, reminding us about what took place on 9/11. And I want to thank my colleagues from the New Jersey and New York area who have to remind all of Congress what happened on 9/11 and why it's so important to make sure that we live up to the expectation of those 9/11 families. So thank you.
Any questions for us? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.